Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar that we'll be giving here on perennial grain species as border crops. My name is Ebony Murrell, Dr. Ebony Murrell. I'm the crop protection ecologist here at the Land Institute. And joining me today is Jess Butters, recently graduated master's in science from the entomology department at Kansas State University. Both Jess and I collaborated on this project, which we'll be telling you about. Before I get started on the actual presentation, I just wanted to let everybody know that we do seem to be having some difficulties with the Q&A for submitting questions. So if you are, let's see, if you are having concerns or if you have any questions, please just submit them through the chat. And also, I wanted to let you know that we are recording this session. So if for some reason you have some colleagues who would be interested in looking at this webinar after the fact, we will be posting that within the next couple of weeks at the Land Institute website. So without further ado, I will go ahead and get started and give you a little background on what's going on. So for most people, who are logging onto this webinar, you're probably aware of the Land Institute, who we are and what we do, but for those who may not be, the Land Institute was founded in 1976. It is a nonprofit organization devoted to increasing perenniality in the landscape, the agricultural landscape specifically. And beginning in 1983, that's when we actually started to develop perennial grains in order to add to our grain crops, the majority of which are annual, and hopefully eventually replace some of those annual crops that we currently grow with perennial varieties. There are a lot of potential benefits of perennial systems, especially perennial grain systems. Perennials build soil and soil communities over time. So you can not only reduce erosion, but you can actually reverse the process and build soil. Perennials also provide more habitat, more permanent habitat for beneficial organisms, such as natural enemies and pollinators. We'll primarily be discussing pollinators today. Many perennials are more tolerant of weather extremes such as drought, heat, and so on. So in the face of changing climate and more severe weather events, perennials can hold a big advantage for grain and crop production stability. And many perennials require fewer inputs once they're established. So they may not require quite as much in terms of herbicides or some fertilizers. Now, perennial grains is a fairly new concept. Kernza is now what we consider to be in pre-commercial phase. That is a grain developed here at the Land Institute. But Kernza actually began as a forage crop. It is the forage crop intermediate wheatgrass. And perennials as forages is really not a new concept. So anybody out there who's listening who is an expert in forages, you already know what a lot of the benefits of perennials are in the forage capacity. But something I want to point out is that forages also tend to be fairly multi-purpose. So for example, alfalfa is primarily grown as forage, but there are certainly farmers, even in Kansas, who, if it looks like it's not going to be a really good forage harvest during the summer, they may go ahead and grow that alfalfa out and harvest it for seed and sell the seed. So forages as they stand already provide the capacity to serve as both a forage and as a grain. It's just a matter, in the case of developing perennial grains, of increasing the seed size and the yield stability of that grain. Alfalfa is also used to build soil health within a crop rotation. So if you grow alfalfa for a few years in organic rotation, then you can use the soil nutrients that it's built up, and you can cycle in corn after that, and you don't have to fertilize as much. Sainfoin is another example of a forage crop that's grown primarily out west, especially in North Great Plains states such as Montana, Wyoming, and so on. It's another forage crop. but it also has great potential as a honey crop. It produces a really good honey, so you can get more than one product out of your sainfoin field. And also, being a legume like alfalfa, it can be used to build soil health. Kernza, as I mentioned, actually began as a forage, and we've domesticated it by increasing the seed size to make it a grain crop. So it still has that potential to serve as both a forage and a grain, as well as providing very good weed management. So the idea that perennial grains can serve more than one purpose is something we really want to investigate, because while we are developing crops to be perennial grains, we also think that it would be useful in an agronomic sense and help to promote agricultural adoption if we can document and possibly promote several uses of these perennial grains other than just the seed yield that they provide. So with that in mind, we began a project funded by NRCS in 2018, investigating the ecosystem services of these perennial crops. And the basis for this grant was that in their current form, a lot of these crops could be planted as border crops to annual crops that are currently grown, where they can provide services at the borders and also potentially provide services that can flow over into the annual cropping systems without requiring that much maintenance once they're established. So to investigate those ecosystem services, we planted 6 different treatments. Our positive control for this study was a prairie mixture, a 9-species prairie mixture that was very forb heavy. There were 6 species of flowering forbs and then 3 species of grasses. And the idea behind this is that this prairie mix would provide maximum pollinator services. Our negative control, so to speak, was Kernza, which, as we said, is both a forage and a grain crop, but it being a grass, it's wind pollinated, so it provides very minimal pollinator services, but could still potentially provide some of the other services that we measured. And some of those other services we looked at included weed suppression abilities, forage production, and forage quality. So this was a grant in conjunction with both the Land Institute and Kansas State University. Jess worked with her mentors. Dr. Tanya Kim is the lab that Jess was in, and then also Dr. Brian Spiesman. So this is a 3-year, we're reporting today on the results of that 3-year project. We don't have data from every single year, but we'll try to give you a map of sort of what's going on and what data we're reporting as we go along. To give you a brief overview of the experimental design, we established 18-foot by 18-foot plots of each of our perennial crops. Each of the plots were spaced at least 32 feet apart from each other, or 10 meters. And so we had all 6 treatments arranged in fields like this, and we had 4 fields located throughout the Land Institute property in Salina, Kansas. So each of the 4 sites were spaced anywhere from half a mile to 2 miles apart from one another. We did that in order to create distinct environments so that we could better measure pollinator services. The medium that was planted in between all the plots was just a fescue mix that was kept mowed throughout the year. In order to establish our plots, we did a combination of seeding and transplanting depending on the species. So Kernza, alfalfa, and sainfoin were all seeded in fall of 2018 at about a 1/2 inch deep using a seed drill with 7-inch rows. Alfalfa and sainfoin, we have the varieties shown up here if that interests you. And then Kernza, we used Kernza from our cycle 5 Kernza development. Seeding rates are shown up here, between 10 to 12.5 pounds per acre, depending on the species. And then for sainfoin and cut plant, we have actually seeded those with the seed drill before. It can be done, but in this case, with these small plots, we thought it might be a better idea in order to not only ensure establishment, but ensure flowering within the first year, we elected to grow out seedlings and transplant them. So normally sainfoin and cut plant, they just form a rosette the first year that they develop from seed, and they don't flower. They don't usually flower until the second year. By growing out seedlings and transplanting them in September 2018, we were actually able to get them to flower the very first full year of the study in summer 2019. And so we were able to collect more pollinator data that way. And then for our prairie plots, we also grew out the seedlings because prairie, as you know, can be somewhat tricky to establish. And we wanted to make sure that the prairie plots that we established were as equal to one another as possible at the time we began the study, to sort of give them the best chance for success. So we grew out seedlings of every one of the 9 species and transplanted a total of 144 seedlings into each plot in, I'm sorry, that should be March of 2019, not August of 2019. Once the plots were established, we did hand weed the plots in 2019. And then beginning in 2020, we only removed field bindweed. Otherwise, the plots were allowed to get as weedy as they could, and we just measured weed biomass to look at how well the established plots stood up to weed pressure. No fertilizer was applied to any of these plots at any time. Again, we wanted to treat them as a border crop. If you plant it and let it go and did minimal management, how would it do by itself? Alfalfa was mowed 2 times per summer to simulate what a forage harvest might be for a border crop. We figured that if it was a border crop as opposed to a main forage crop, it would probably be harvested a little less often. Forage people who are listening in, feel free to correct me on that. But that was our reasoning for only mowing it twice per summer. And then sainfoin, we also mowed once per summer because sainfoin tends to develop and bloom very early on in May and June. And so we did mow the sainfoin in June so that it would have a chance to regrow. And in some cases, it did flower a little bit later in the season too. And then at the end of every growing season in October or November, we flail mowed all of the plots in order to give them, give the plant space to regrow the following year. So that's the basic experimental design. I showed the picture I showed you previously shows how the plots looked at their peak, I would say, in the summer when they're growing and healthy. But what do the plots look like now, 3 years later? I have a little video to show you that shows the plots in real time, and I want to apologize in advance. I really did want to do this live field side, but unfortunately the internet connection was fairly poor at the field side. So I've recorded this session for you, but I did it just yesterday morning so you can get an idea of what the plots look like right now.
Here we are at some of our NRCS study plots. We often call them the pollinator plots as a nickname. And this is one of 4 blocks of the 6 treatments that we have planted across the Land Institute property. The plot here to the left, or in the center of this camera, is our sainfoin plot. And then between the sainfoin plot and the tall plants you see there, if you look a little farther back, you can see another plot of green vegetation. That's alfalfa. The tall plants now in the center are silphium or silflower. That's the species Silphium integrifolia. To the right of the silflower plot and further back are some more tall plants. That's cut plant, which is Silphium perfoliatum. And then to the right of cut plant, you can see a sort of grassy plot. That is Kernza, or intermediate wheatgrass. And then the plot closest to us here is our 9 species prairie mixture. So these plots are now 3 years old. This is the 3rd year of the study, and we're going to get a closer look at the plots and see what the establishment looks like and what the weed pressure is. Okay, the first plot I mentioned was the sainfoin plot. This is actually what a sainfoin plant looks like. This is a plant I pulled out of our greenhouse. As you can see, the plot looks like not sainfoin. It is completely overrun by weeds. There are a few sainfoin plants buried in here if you look closely, but for the most part, we have a lot of field bindweed. This is despite the fact that we did weed these fields for bindweed. We have some foxtail, we have some volunteer Maximilian sunflower, and this fern-like plant is actually a native plant. It's called Illinois bundleflower. And yeah, this is basically what the sainfoin looks like after 3 years. We did get some establishment in the first year, but over the course of the following years, we got quite a bit of invasion by weeds. This plot is the alfalfa plot, and as you can see, it has much better establishment than the sainfoin plot we just looked at. All of this is alfalfa except for that little patch of foxtail over there. We did have a vigorous establishment and growth over time. This plot was harvested twice this year to mimic what might happen with the border crop. So alfalfa is harvested more frequently throughout the year. This flag is 6 feet tall. So if you step back and look at the plot, you can get an idea of about how tall the alfalfa is. We have let the alfalfa grow out at the end of the year here because this is, after all, a border crop. It probably wouldn't be harvested as frequently, but pretty soon here we will be mowing all of these plots down in preparation for the winter. This plot is our silphium or silflower plot. And you can see the orange flag right there, the 6 foot tall flag. So the silflower is quite tall. This crop is a native prairie plant in North America. It is in the same family as annual sunflower, not the same genus. Silphium integrifolium is being developed as an oilseeds crop, and sometimes it's hybridized with the cut plant, which is Silphium perfoliatum over there. And we'll talk about perfoliatum in a second. But the silflower typically puts on these stems every year, and it blooms between the end of June, early July, into early September in Kansas. Each of these heads, flower heads, there's indeterminate blooming, so there's different flowers being put out and blooming throughout that 2-month period. And then each of those heads develops seeds with oil content very similar to the oil profile of annual sunflower. So there are still a few green leaves on these plants. They stay green until early September at least. You can see some invasion of weeds into this plot. We have had mare's tail get into the plot, some foxtail. There's some yellow flowers over here. That's actually Maximilian sunflower, a plant that's managed to invade. We do get a little bit of Illinois bundleflower in these plots too. But the silflower generally manages to hold up pretty well to weed pressure. Okay, this is our cut plant plot, Silphium perfoliatum. There's our 6 foot flag there, so you can see that this has very vigorous growth and biomass. Also, it develops a little bit later than in the season than silflower, so many of the leaves are still quite green, as are these stems, still green and somewhat pliable, given that they're fairly thick stems. It's called cut plant because it has, the leaves form this little cup in the middle, which can collect a little bit of water sometimes, which is fun. Like silflower, it puts out multiple flower heads, which are a little bit smaller than the ones that silflower produces, but it's very much the same concept. So this flower head is dried out, and what I'm poking at here is an individual seed on that flower head. This plant actually is grown as a forage and biofuels crop in Germany, and there's interest in it as a biofuels and forage crop in North America as well. One thing that you'll notice is that weed pressure in this plot is quite low. So there's one Illinois bundleflower plant there, a few small weeds on the ground. but the weed pressure is extremely low in cut plant. It has proven to be very good at blocking the soil, shading out weed competition. This plot is our Kernza plot, intermediate wheatgrass. Kernza is domesticated intermediate wheatgrass that has been bred to increase the seed size. The seed size on these plants is not very large because this plot, like all of our border crop plots, has never been fertilized. We left them unfertilized on purpose to more closely mimic the conditions that would probably exist in farmers' border field crops. You want to be able to plant something and let it grow and let it do its thing without a lot of management. After 3 years, we do see a fair amount of invasion by Illinois bundleflower, plus a single Maximilian sunflower plant there. We did find this a little surprising. Kernza is normally quite resistant to weed pressure. And indeed, if you look around this plot, you're hard pressed to find any field vine weed at all. So it was successful at keeping that weed and many other weeds at bay, but we did get some intrusion by Illinois bundleflower. This is year 3 of the Kernza plot. And you can see about how tall the plants are if you compare it to our 6-foot-tall flag right there. The 6th treatment in our NRCS study is a prairie mixture. So this is a 9-species prairie mixture. It did start out as 9 species. You can see now that there's really only a few species that are prevalent. Most prevalent this time of year is the Maximilian sunflower. So this is in the same genus as annual sunflower, Helianthus. But this type of sunflower is perennial compared to the annual sunflower. The blue flowers you see here, that is blue sage or pitcher sage, which is another late growing and blooming plant. So unlike any of the other plots we've looked at today, this plot is still flowering. It started flowering in May with purple prairie clover, and it is continuing to flower now with the blue sage and Maximilian sunflower. So in terms of pollinator resources, this plot is still doing quite well. And you can see there's also a fair amount of green vegetation if you were to harvest this for forage. It is surprising that the Maximilian sunflower wound up largely taking over the entire plot. But we do have some grasses in here, big blue stem, little blue stem, and tall drop seed. But those were largely crowded out by the Maximilian sunflower after the first year. The biomass growth is quite vigorous. So there's our 6-foot-tall flag there. And the weed suppression is also very good. So once again, we do have Illinois bundleflower in this plot. It's perhaps looks more appropriate here though than in any of our other plots, since Illinois bundleflower is itself a prairie species. But overall, the prairie mixture performed very well in keeping weed pressure down once it was established.
Okay, so, excuse me. So that's basically how the plots look now and how they did with weed pressure. The next thing we're going to do is talk about the pollinator performance of these plots in 2019 and 2020. And so to do that, I'm going to hand this session over to Jess. And then after Jess speaks, we'll have the chance for a few minutes for questions, after which we'll then talk about the forage data.
All right, I'll share my screen and we can get going. Oh, excuse me, with the Excel file. All right, so as Ebony said, my name is Jessica Butters. I recently graduated with my master's degree from Kansas State. And this project that I shared with Ebony was a part of my thesis, one of the 2 chapters. So the title of my talk today for this webinar is Providing for Pollinators, Integrating Natural Habitats. So just to get a baseline understanding as I walk you through this, we consider pollinators any animal that transfers pollen from one flower to another. And that can be your normal idea of pollinators like bees, serpids, or flower flies, butterflies, moths, skippers, beetles, but they can also be larger animals like birds and bats. For our specific research with the Land Institute, we focused on these main groups of insects that are pictured here and listed right above. It's good to quantify how important pollinators can be, especially in an agricultural setting. So pollinators, so 1/3 of world crops rely upon pollination services. And those services are estimated to be worth up to $577 billion globally annually. So there is a large amount of sort of revenue that is, or a service that is being provided basically for free from a mix of pollinators. And in a sense, you can think of these pollinators working together. It's native pollinators such as monarchs, sweat bees, and it can be non-native as well, such as honeybees. And I think that it's hard to sort of picture what native pollinators can look like. So here I have pictured species that we actually caught at the Land Institute. These aren't my pictures. I looked up the species and then found pictures to show you. But as you can see, there's a high diversity of native pollinators, everything from metallic sweat bees to fuzzy bumblebees, these beautiful longhorn bees, down to the different lepidopterans or skippers, moths, and butterflies. So we're trying to address a wide array of pollinators besides the honeybees that the United States is mostly dependent upon today. And it is a problem that we're mostly dependent upon honeybees because since 1945, they've actually lost almost 60% of their original numbers in the US. And that's mostly due to like diseases through the varroa mite and also increased pesticide use. So that is a very hard problem to solve when it comes to where we're going to find our pollination services. But they're not the only pollinators that are under threat. We're also experiencing native pollinator decline. We've lost about 99% of our original monarch populations here in the US, and that's received a lot of press, and most people are aware of that. So it's an overall decline. The decline is occurring in all pollinators, and we need to find out why this is happening and what we can do about it so that we don't lose our ecosystem services that are helping 1/3 of our crops. And to do that, we need to talk a little bit about what the cause is. And it is mostly due to agricultural intensification. So we're increasing our fertilizer and our pesticide inputs, but the big reason is our field expansion. We're going to the very edges and borders of the lands that we are cultivating. And when we do that, we experience habitat loss and fragmentation. There's not a lot of natural habitat left in these landscapes like pictured on the right. And when we don't have the ecosystem, the natural ecosystem, we of course can't access ecosystem services. There's nowhere for natural enemies or pollinators to live in this area. And when they're not able to integrate into our agricultural areas, we could experience lower crop yields, especially if your crop is pollinator dependent, such as tomatoes, blueberries, that sort of thing. So our solution to this problem is to find a way to integrate natural habitat into the agricultural landscape to receive these services. And to do that, we are testing the implementation of border crops. And so our research objective around this solution that we came up with the Land Institute was to measure how native and non-native border crops affect the abundance and diversity of pollinators at the Land Institute. So this is sort of an image of what our landscape looks like currently. We have our natural areas that are very separate from our agricultural areas. And you can imagine that there's really no reason or ability for beneficial insects to integrate into our agricultural systems here on the right. There's nowhere for them to live and there's nothing attracting them. So it makes sense that we aren't experiencing as many ecosystem services as we could. But so with the Land Institute, we're looking for ways to integrate small amounts of natural land so that we can provide that incentive and that support in order to start receiving more benefits. And as Ebony mentioned before, we are looking at 6 crops in total. We have the 4 candidate crops that she mentioned earlier that are the focus, so Kernza, sainfoin, and the 2 sunflower species. And we're also looking at native versus non-native here. So the left are the non-native border crops that we're testing, and the right are the native ones. And then we also are testing 2 crops that are actually already in use in agricultural systems. So it's going to be fun to look at the differences in those as well. And our overall question boils down to which ones attract the most pollinators and why is going to be the main idea that we're going to be answering today. And like Ebony said, we planted each of these crops in 5 by 5 meter plots at 4 different sites. So we were looking at pollinators and testing them in 24 different sampling sites to answer this question. In order to measure the amount of pollinators that are visiting each crop, we conducted timed observations. We did 2 replicates or 2 people circling a crop for 10 minutes. And we did that once a month throughout the growing seasons for 2 years in 2019 and 2020. And we also, to answer the why question, why are certain pollinators drawn to certain crops? We had help with the Land Institute to measure floral area. So we had flower counts, we looked up the average flower width, and we multiplied those together to get a floral area for each crop. And we also measured the bloom period in weeks. So how many weeks are flowers available to pollinators? And just a quick side note, you can see me here on the left looking, I am actually excited, you just can't see by the picture, but I'm holding a little handheld vacuum here, waiting for a pollinator to land on a flower. And what this is, it's a little handheld vacuum that's been altered to collect pollinators. So they'll go in through the tube here, sucks them up, and there's this nice little canister here to hold your angry queen bumblebees so that you don't get stung. And it is a lot less scary than using a net. So these are great handy little tools that we used in the field. And so here are our results. This is going to be overall pollinator abundance. So lumping together bees, flower flies, and butterflies, moths, all of that, and how each of the 6 different crops performed. I'll show you the 2019 data first, and then I'll show you the 2020 data. So you can see in 2019 that the native crops here on the right outperformed the non-native crops here on the left. Silflower and prairie did the best, and they were very significantly different from alfalfa, sainfoin, and Kernza. Kernza did poorly, which we expected. That was our negative control. And then in 2020, you actually see this boost. The non-native crops caught up to the native crops. And while the native crops still statistically performed better, you can see that the playing field, it's much more even. So there's definitely an establishment period associated with these non-native crops. And if you think about what Ebony mentioned earlier about needing to start the sunflowers out and then transplanting them, it might be a bit more even than we think. And especially here, you can see with sainfoin. Sainfoin statistically performed significantly better in terms of its bee and pollinator attraction than it did in 2019. So thinking about establishment periods while you're deciding which crops, border crops to implement can be very important. And then in terms of what each treatment attracted, the sunflowers, cut plant and silflower, attracted mostly bees, while the alfalfa attracted more lepidopterans. You can see that in the purple here. So butterflies and moths are in purple, and then bees are in gold here. I would say that prairie looks like it attracted mostly bees, and it did, but it also attracted the 2nd most amount of lepidopterans compared to alfalfa. So it is actually a pretty good intermediate if you want to attract a more diverse set of pollinators compared to silflower and cut plant. Kernza looks like it did fantastic with bees. It didn't. This pie chart here shows basically 2 bumblebees that seemed to take a break in the Kernza. So they landed and we counted them, but Kernza, as you can see by the lack of a box plot here, actually did terrible with attracting pollinators. So we can see that overall, the native plants here do a great job of supporting both bees and butterflies, and that they do in fact attract pollinators to agricultural areas. So in conclusion, we find that prairie mix overall attracted the most. That was our positive control. That makes sense. Statistically, however, it's similar to our single species sunflower crops, the silflower and the cut plant, which is actually pretty interesting because given how diverse it is, it's impressive that the two sunflower species as a monoculture could attract statistically a similar amount. And in terms of floral resources, I can show you the data once I'm done if you're interested during the Q&A session. But we did actually find that high floral resources do attract more pollinators. Like that is the mechanism at play here. So crops with high floral area attract more pollinators, and also the crops with the longer bloom periods, the more weeks that they have available in fluorescence, attracted more pollinators as well. So this is great news. It means that if we do find a way to integrate these natural habitats, and right now it's through the implementation of border crops, we can possibly facilitate movement throughout the landscape. And that leads not only to a healthier pollinator population, because if you think if this natural habitat over here disappears, they're kind of at a loss, but also it allows them to move into our agricultural areas and bring their services with them. So it's nice to see that we do have significant results and they do in fact attract pollinators. It's always nice to have actual results in ecology. So very exciting. I'd like to thank Tanya Kim, my advisor, and Ebony for helping me with this project specifically. There was a lot of Land Institute staff work that went into this as well with the weeding, hours of weeding. So thank you so much for that. And also I'd like to thank my lab here, those who have helped me identify bees and lepidopterans, and also my scholarships and grants that have helped me. And with that, I am ready for questions. So thank you for listening.
Thanks, Jess. I think we do have time for any question, a couple of questions that people might have. While other people are thinking of questions, Jess, one that came up during your talk was somebody asked, let's see, how do you believe native pollinators would survive in a glyphosate/GMO neighborhood? I have 320 acres organic surrounded by thousands of acres of GMO crops. Is planting for pollinators a futile effort given that they'll be under synthetic pressures?
I don't, in my personal opinion, I haven't done a ton of research on the impact of GMOs, but I don't think that there's any functionality lost with a genetically modified plant. Like a plant to a pollinator is just that. And if it's providing pollen or not, it'll either visit it or not. So I don't think it's futile at all to try to integrate something into your area. And I honestly don't think it's been researched well enough to decide the effects of GMOs, but for now anyway, I don't see any reason to not try to boost. I don't think that's futile at all.
Cool.
I don't think they care, honestly, if it's GMO or not, because they don't know better.
Yeah. If there's flowers, they're going to try to
exactly
eat on them and take advantage of them. Okay, thanks. We did get another question up here asking, were there grasses in the prairie mix as well? I'll field that one. Yes, there were 3 species of grasses that were in the prairie mix. It was big blue stem, little blue stem, and tall dropseed. Yeah, good question.
It was forb heavy though.
What's that?
It was forb heavy.
Yes, it was. We purposefully chose a very forb heavy mix to try to give it the best chance for pollinators as possible. Probably if you bought a commercial seed mix to plant, even if it was a pollinator mix or labeled as one, it would probably have more grasses in it than what we put in. Okay, I don't see any other questions at the moment, so perhaps we could go on. Would you mind unsharing your screen? Just thank you. And I will jump back to mine. Oh, wait, we got a question real quick. Somebody asked, is the surrounding area of our study a sprayed area or is there a clearance? None of the land at the Land Institute is, none of the area around these pollinator plots was treated with anything. But that being said, we like a couple of the plots are adjacent to a conventional wheat field. So Yeah, so there's that. And then also I will say that the Land Institute itself only farms about 100 acres or so worth of land. So our whole research area size is not very large. And so certainly the farms that surround the Land Institute, many of them are conventional sorghum, soybean, wheat, and corn crops. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and go on and discuss the forage data and what we found there. So in order to sample our forage data, we collected this in 2020 and 2021. I'm mostly going to be showing you information from the 2020 data because we're still analyzing and processing the 2021 data. So to do our forage harvests in 2020, we sampled 3 times throughout the season, late May, early July, and early September. Each time we went into each of those 18 by 18 foot plots, put down a square of PVC pipe that was a 1/4 meter square. So, you know, about 1.5 feet by 1.5 feet, and set that on the ground. Collected all of the biomass that was inside there, separated the weeds out from it, dried it, and weighed it in order to get our biomass weight. And then for forage quality, at each of the sampling points we collected, we dried the samples and we shipped them off for NIR analysis, near infrared spectroscopy for all of our treatments. That was done by North Border Analytics in Montana. And then for the cut plant, silflower, and sainfoin samples, since there really isn't good data on the NIR readings for those samples, we sent all of those samples off for wet chemistry, which was done through Dairyland forage analysis. So the data you're looking at reflect the NIR values, but the NIR values for those unusual forages were validated through wet chemistry. So to show you the forage biomass that we got, these are the samples from July, where I would say most of the crops were at their peak. I'll also point out on this graph that the alfalfa forage values is actually reflects 3 harvests. So the May, July, and September, again, to sort of mimic what you would be harvesting from a border crop. You wouldn't just count one harvest from your alfalfa crop, because alfalfa you can get multiple crops out of. So the forage biomass, as you can see, was significantly highest for both silflower or silphium and cut plants. All of those were significantly higher than any other treatment. Alfalfa was the next best in terms of forage, and then sainfoin, again, because of that fairly poor establishment and maintenance, did fairly low. The prairie was surprisingly low too. Now you'll note though that this forage biomass was collected in July. That's before that Maximilian sunflower really starts to ramp up and get taller. You can get a larger forage harvest later in the season if you allow the Max sunflower to grow. One thing I'll point out about prairie mixtures, though, is that they tend to be very variable according to the weather. So one reason why prairies are so resilient is because they are very plastic in their growth in response to how much or how little rain there is. Since they're going to live year after year and are not really crop species, if it's a bad year, they just won't grow as much, or they'll put out flowers when they're only 3 feet tall as opposed to when they're 6 feet tall. So that's something that you should keep in mind when looking at the prairie data. Nevertheless, consistently, we found that silflower and cut plant produce very high forage biomass. So biomass is great, but what does that mean in terms of actual forage quality? So here's some graphs from our forage analyses. I'll point to the crude protein first. That tends to be of great interest to people who have livestock, because protein is especially important for milk production in dairy cattle, for example. All livestock certainly need protein, but for milk production, it's very prized value. And you can see with crude protein, alfalfas are purple dots up here. It consistently had the highest crude protein over the course of the season. That's really not surprising for anybody who works with forages. It's one of the many reasons that alfalfa is considered to be the queen of forages. That being said, cut plant and silflower did fairly well in the protein department too, although their protein was much higher earlier in the season than it was later in the season. Every crop tended to have reduced protein content as the season progressed, as the plants get older and age. But there was a fairly steep drop off in the cut plant and silflower between early and late seasons. If you look at ADF and NDF, so acid detergent fiber and neutral detergent fiber, there tended to be, there was an increase in ADF over the course of the season for silflower and cut plant, not so much for the other crops. Neutral detergent fiber tended to increase over the course of the season slightly for everything, although I guess the ones in the middle remain fairly consistent, alfalfa, sainfoin, and prairie. But you'll notice that the NDF for cut plant and silflower is very low. So that, what I've been told, indicates pretty high digestibility. If there's any forage folks out there, you can correct me on that. I'm by no means an expert in forages, but this is something that I've been told. So what that means in terms of relative feed value, so if you look at the all of those things factored in together, the protein and the lignin content and the digestible carbohydrates, you see that there's actually extremely high relative feed values for silflower and cut plant early on in the season, much higher than anything else. And even by the end of the season, cut plant scored a little bit higher, although not significantly higher than alfalfa and sainfoin. But even if it's not significant, it is comparable to those forages at even by the end of the season. And mind you, September, I just showed you what those plants look like in September. They're starting to turn brown. So even after they've flowered and are getting close to the end of the season, they still have pretty high relative feed value. Not surprisingly, Kernza was fairly low in relative feed value, especially given that it does better early on, very early in the season in the spring, but as it starts to bolt and go to seed, then the feed value decreases. And then prairie also was kind of middle of the road in terms of relative feed value. Now, if you look at all of these factors together, what these plots are doing is basically graphing out like how well each of these crops do in all of the services. So I'm happy to explain these numbers to you. Basically, they're standardized Z-scores for each service that we measured. But what you really need to know looking at these is that the farther from zero this value is, the larger this value is, the more of that service that particular crop provided. So in the case of cut plant, it was really awesome at weed suppression. You compare that to Kernza over here, also did very well for weed suppression. This is in the year 2020. But then if you compare the two in terms of their forage harvest biomass, cut plant did really well. Kernza didn't really have as much forage biomass. So looking at these graphs, the larger this shape is, basically the more multifunctional, the more overall services a given crop provides. And cut plant and silflower really provided a lot of overall services. If you factor in pollinator abundance and diversity, forage quality and harvest biomass and weed suppression, all of those things together, those two crops did very, very well. Kernza, there was one thing it provided really well, that was weed suppression. The other services we measured, it didn't do so well. In the case of sainfoin down here, that's the purple, you can see that the harvest biomass wasn't great. Weed suppression wasn't great. Again, it got overrun by weeds by the third year. But forage quality was decent, and the pollinator abundance was also pretty good. So yeah, this is a way of just sort of visualizing if you want a crop that provides multiple services all at once. You're from what we found in our study, the best crops overall seem to be the cut plant and silflower, but and this is a big but, it depends on what services you want from your border crop. If you don't want all of these services, if you only want a subset of them, then you might want to pick out something that a little different. For example, if you really want to focus on the pollinator quality, pollinator resource quality of your border crop, you probably still want to stick with a prairie mixture. So yeah. So to conclude, what we found were that all plots established and maintained biomass over time, except for the sainfoin by the third year. That being said, we have successfully grown sainfoin and managed forage fields in Kansas. So I would not give up on sainfoin as a forage crop if you're interested in it as a forage crop, but as an unmanaged border crop, it doesn't seem to do so well. The prairie mix still seems to be the gold standard for pollinator resources, but silflower and cut plant, as I pointed out, also supported excellent pollinator communities. So if you need something that's a little more straightforward to, plant and grow out, those may be options. Cut plant definitely had the highest weed suppression. I will say that most of the crops, except for sainfoin, did perform at least adequately in that regard. And then cut plant and silflower excelled in biomass production, and they seem to do really well in overall forage quality. We were a bit surprised by that, but if you actually look back at Aldo Leopold's account in the Sam County Almanac, he talked a lot about silphium. He was talking about compass plant, which is closely related, but he made the observation that when cattle were allowed to graze a prairie, that the silphium was one of the first things to disappear. So cattle really seem to like it anecdotally. And then this forage quality data seem to support that idea that it could be a really good forage. So looking ahead to, like services that border crops like these could provide, honey crops is certainly a possibility from the pollinator data just collected, and also some work we've done here. Sainfoin, we already know, produces excellent honey in the places it's grown, and it can yield up to 350 pounds of honey per acre. Silflower also produces a tasty honey. We actually have a couple of our hives here at the Land Institute and have collected silflower honey. It's really good. And the honeybees seem to do well off it, as well as the native pollinators. Cut plant, the honey potential has been assessed for that, not for silflower, but for cut plant. And it's been estimated that you could get up to 500 to 700 pounds of acre as honey potential. The caveat on this is that study only looked at the amount of nectar and calculated the amount of honey you could get. They didn't actually put bees on those plots, but that is research we hope to investigate in the future. Getting back to cut plant and silflower as forage crops, though, I'm excited about the potential there, given the data that we found. Since it has high digestibility, perhaps there could be a market for it for bulking up beef cattle. Cows anecdotally really seem to love it. So we used to have a couple of cows on TLI property, and whenever we throw silphium cuttings over the fence, they would fight each other over it, and they would eat everything, including the stems, not just the leaves. And there's great biomass production for both cut plant and silflower. The challenges I can foresee with this crop, I wouldn't say it's like ready for everybody to plant as a border crop tomorrow, because there are still some questions we need to answer. So we probably can only get about one harvest per year out of cut plant and silflower. And if you harvest it for forage or graze it for forage, it's unlikely that it's going to be able to grow back and produce as much seed, if any, within the same year. So that could be a consideration as we're continuing to develop it as a seed crop, is that it may be forage some year and seed other years, but probably not both within the same year. It being a very large plant with thick stems, there could possibly be some baling and processing challenges. I'd be really interested to hear from the forage folks on that. And then of course, we actually need to conduct some feed studies with silflower to see how cattle perform if they're fed this as a forage. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Hopefully we still have a few more minutes for questions, but I would like to thank you all for attending today. The last thing I'm going to do before you leave, if you would let me do that, is, hang on, let me stop my screen. There's a survey that I would like everybody to fill out, and I'm going to put that link in the chat. If you miss it in the chat, that's okay. We'll email it to you later, but we would really like to hear back from you as insofar as what you think about the data we presented today, the potential of some of these perennial grains as forage or border or pollinator crops. But yeah, thank you all for coming so much. So let's open it up for questions. Let's see. One of the questions I see is, did the prairie mix include silphium and cut plant, or would it make sense to add it? Yeah, it could make sense to add it. Our mixture did not, because we purposefully wanted to test silflower and cut plant as their own crop. But yes, they're both native plants. They're both native prairie plants. They both grow well in the prairie. So it would totally make sense to, if you wanted to plant a prairie mixture and include silflower or cut plant, then yeah, absolutely. That'd be great. Let's see. Someone asked, looking at these on a commercial basis, how wide would be a recommended strip as a border or between adjacent crops? Good question. Do you have any thoughts from the pollinator perspective, Jess?
As far as a recommended width for a border strip, not really. Like with ours, we were kind of doing a choice assay, right? It's almost like having a buffet available and seeing what they like. I think the next step for this experiment would be to, test this at a full scale, right? And see. But I'd say as long as it's big enough to see from a bird's eye view, a lot of pollinators too, they only travel 120 meters. So it can be relatively small and something in the area could easily use it. So I don't think they'll have to be as big as you might think. But again, that's all relative. So I don't really know.
Yeah, I guess my philosophy is any border is better than no border, but I mean, I grew up in central Illinois where you plant the corn right up to the road, even when you're not supposed to. Kansans seem to be a little better about that. So I'm heartened to see that there's still quite a few borders around fields in this region where you still see the annual sunflowers growing and such. But if you can afford to plant a wider strip, if you wanted to harvest it as forage there, that would certainly be great. Cool. Good questions, guys. Does anybody have any other questions?
Is the survey to everyone or just the hosts and panelists?
Oh dear. Oh goodness. Ah, okay. I just posted it to everyone. Thanks.
There we go.
Thank you, Jess. I didn't catch that. Goodness. So on that case, there was a question earlier that I thought I answered in the chat, but maybe I just answered it to the panelists. Somebody asked, how do you feel the plots would respond to mob grazing in terms of fertility and weed competition? And my response to that is, I think it would depend on the crop. So all of these crops can be grazed and will grow back. But I would say that alfalfa, Kernza, and prairie would probably bounce back the most quickly. I know that there's concerns about grazing just straight alfalfa because that can cause bloat. But, just as far as the plants themselves, they're probably the ones who are best equipped to bounce back quickly. Within the same season. Sainfoin usually is only harvested once, maybe twice a year as forage, so I'm not sure how it would rebound if it was grazed. Cut plant and silflower, I know will regrow, but they don't necessarily get as large in the same year. And they may not flower as much. Depends on the time of year that they're grazed. If they're grazed early enough, they can come back and flower. They'll just be shorter plants. If they're grazed a bit later in the year, they're still going to grow back. I mean, I mow them down in September and they'll still produce little leaves before the end of the season. So they don't die, but they may not come back and be large and flower. Yeah, so that would be my answer to that. Cool. Well, if nobody has any other questions, oh, wait, we do have one more question. How many years will this be functional before needing to be replanted? Good question. Short answer is I don't know. We've only done this study for 3 years. I certainly know that there's alfalfa fields that have been maintained for over a decade as forage fields, and certainly prairie is meant to, last for quite a long period of time. As far as the length of the lifespan of the plants themselves, both silflower and cut plant can live for over a decade. We have a few silphium plants here on campus that are 30 years old. So they are very long-lived plants. I think one of the challenges could be potentially like what the weed pressure might be after 10 years versus 3 years. It could be quite different. So we don't quite have the answer to that yet. But most of these plants they're not weakly perennial. They are very strongly perennial and they are meant to last a very long time. Cool. Well, we're a little bit after 11, so I'm going to go ahead and end the session. Thank you all so much for coming. And if you haven't clicked on the survey link, you can go ahead and do that now. Or we can, like I said, we can email it out to you later. I want to thank everybody for their interest. Thank you, Jess, for presenting today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have questions in the future. Take care.